Yeah, definitely. So I think in all specialty, but perhaps specifically for psychiatry, we're looking for someone who's genuinely want to be there, right? And the way you can showcase that is through your whole applications as a whole. So your CV, your experience, your research, just kind of like your activities outside medicine too. Perhaps if it could all be tied in into psychiatry, that'd be great. And then the other thing that I believe is also important is how you present it in terms of being objective versus subjective. And what I mean by that is I always try to highlight numbers and concrete facts when highlighting my achievements or things that I do versus just fluff or, like rosy, wordy description of some things. And I think that speaks a lot to
The IMG Roadmap is the only podcast dedicated to coaching international medical graduates in success blueprints for this unique pathway. I am Dr. Nina Loom, your host, a previous IMG turned hospital medicine physician, healthcare administrator, speaker, and coach. I empower, encourage, and equip you with actionable steps that you can take towards the residency position of your dreams. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the IMG Roadmap podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Sarah Pospos, and we are on video today. So if you are listening to this podcast, you can find the video format on YouTube as well. And you'll be able to find snippets of the video version on Instagram because we decided to go video. And guess what? We're not like dolled up and we don't care because when it comes to value, when it comes to advancing your career as an IMG, it's not about looks. It's not about what looks great. It's about doing the work. And we're here to add value to your life. Dr. Pospos is here to share her story, her journey, and hopefully you gain some inspiration. So take notes, take heed, listen in, grab a piece of pen and paper, and let's get right into it. Welcome to the show, Dr. Pospos. We're so happy to have you. Where are you calling from? Can you tell the audience?
Yes, and thank you so much, Dr. Loom, for having me today. I really appreciate it. So I'm calling from my home here in California.
Awesome. So you're calling in from Cali, and why don't you tell us what makes you an IMG? Like, why are you an IMG? Or what about your life story defines you as an IMG?
Absolutely. So I was born and raised in Indonesia, where I went to med school. And when I applied to residency, it was actually 4 years out of med school. But despite that, as an IMG or an older IMG in that case, I suppose I was fortunate enough to get 21 interviews, including from places like Yale, Duke, Emory, San Diego, and others.
Wow. Like my eyeballs, like literally, bing, sprung open. I'm like 21 interviews as an IMG 4 years after graduation. So you had all the red flags. Well, not all of them, but you had the whole concern. People are usually concerned about the year of graduation and the fact that they're not fresh out of medical school. Were you applying as a US IMG or a non-US IMG?
Yes, that's a great question. So when I applied, I was a US IMG because I had the permanent residence.
Okay. So you had that going for you, which is also a good point. But at the same time, 21, I mean, let's get into it. So what specialty are you in currently and what specialty did you apply into?
Absolutely. So I only applied to psychiatry and I completed my psychiatry residency, obviously. I was selected as the chief resident. And currently, I'm a practicing psychiatrist focusing on helping high performers in the area, specifically in sports and perinatal psychiatry.
That is so amazing. So you did a general psychiatry residency, and then did you have to do additional training for the second part?
Yes, it's an additional training, but not a specific fellowship.
Okay. How did that work? Tell us more about that, because I've never heard of it before.
Yes, definitely. So for example, for perinatal psychiatry, we have this organization called PSI, where they have certification courses and whatnot, and then you have to pass an exam in order to be certified in that area. So the title, I believe, it's called PMHC. And then for sports psychiatry, similarly, a big organization called ISSP, International Society of Sports Psychiatry, they offer additional training in sports psychiatry where you have to do reading, writing assignments, written assignments, and all this training. And then, you apply it. And then if deemed acceptable, you'd get approved to be certified in that area.
Awesome. That's amazing. That's super amazing. I did not even know that was a specialty or a possibility, right? It's amazing what we learn each day. Even though we think we know a lot of things, there's a lot we can learn. And I just love that you're on the podcast today to share more about your journey into psychiatry and how other IMGs can do the same. So let's get into it. Where did you go to medical school?
Yes, absolutely. So I went to med school back in Indonesia at my university, which is called Katolik University, Atma Jaya Katolik University.
And what year did you graduate from medical school?
So I graduated back in 2013. And then actually I moved to the US right away, but not for medicine. I went here for my grad school. I went to USC for master's in psychology. And after that, I dabbled a bit in business consulting, which is perhaps part of the reason why I'm a couple of years out behind before applying to residency itself.
Was there a reason why you didn't apply right away? Or did you have a true interest in doing this master's program?
So I actually, at that time, have a true interest in the sense that I just don't want to do medicine anymore. I wanted to try something else. I've always been interested in psychology and some strategic consulting. So that's why I pursue this other degree. But along the way, I do realize one day that I miss medicine and I want to be a psychiatrist here. And I have to pivot in that sense.
Pivot. I love that word because that's sort of a very key part of the journey of an IMG is pivoting. We find ourselves in this crossroads where we're very successful at home or we could have been successful at home, but we wanted better, we wanted more. And so we pivot our career to try something else, whether that's residency or in your case, an MPH or a master's degree. But then in the process, you do another pivot and you come back to your primary love, so to speak. So did you apply only into psych or did you have other interests as well?
Yes. So I only applied to psych, and that's because, I just can't imagine honestly doing anything else.
Yeah, that's super awesome. And how many programs did you apply into?
So back then, 2017, I believe there's a total of almost 200 programs in psych or so. I applied broadly, so probably about 150, something along those lines.
Yeah. And then you got 21 interviews. So what is that? 21 divided by 150. You had a pretty, I would say, high percentage of programs calling you back for interview. What do you think made the difference for you? Because it's not usual that I get a lot of IMGs that come on the episode and tell me they had 21. A lot of people end up at an average of like 7, but you had almost, a pretty good rate of return for your investment. Can you tell us what factors you think influenced your invitations?
Yeah, definitely. So looking back, I realized that not only that I'm behind in this race, but extra behind, right? Because 4 years or 2 years at that time out of med school, and then I have this different career path. I would definitely need to address this career pivots and whatnot. So back then, like always, I start from the end, meaning what's my goal? And in this case, my goal is to be a psychiatry resident to get accepted into psychiatry residency here. And from that, I try to think what would be an ideal candidate for that. So in my opinion, it's perhaps someone with a lot of US clinical experience, research experience, and publications to show, a lot of good mentors, a lot of strong letter of recommendations. And also in my case, I think I would need to get all of that in the shortest amount of possible, right? Because clock is ticking.
Right.
So starting backwards from that end goal, I'd imagine I would need, or what I did at that time is I opened my spreadsheet in Excel. Since I'm based in LA, I list all the universities program or universities with psych residency. I listed all the leadership, and that includes the chairs, the program directors for residency and fellowships, their specific research, and their email addresses. And based on that, my second step would be to create a strategic email. Meaning, in my case, I try to think about the audience, right? What their specific needs are and how I can specifically help with that needs. I included numbers just to prove my points. I made it concise, no fluffs. And because everyone has short attention span, I listed my important points first. So based on my interest, specific research interests, I reach out to them. I decided also another key points, I think, I decided to work simultaneously at multiple places for a longer time, let's say a year, versus just doing a short stint at one place, one after another. So let's say 1 month in place A, then 1 month in place B, and so forth. And because of that, I end up working simultaneously at UCLA, UCSD, San Diego, and Riverside, and was able to get 14 publications, 7 of which first authored, 5 research experience, 4 strong letters with mentors who are thought leaders in the field, and also 3 clinical US experiences on top of my completing my steps. So I think that perhaps is one of the big keys of my interview offers from the 21 places that I mentioned.
Yes, absolutely. And so you mentioned a few things that I want our audience to really grasp, right? 1, it was very thoughtful, it was intentional, and highly strategic. I mean, you went for the jugular, and you mentioned doing your research, learning about the audience, networking with them on the front end, front loading your application, those research experiences that you did, the work experience that you did, leveraging those opportunities, and then snowballing that into your application cycle. And then bam, we want to talk to you. Because I'm sure when you were researching, you were looking for, like you said, thought leaders in the field. You weren't just looking to work under anyone. You were strategic about how you went about that process. And I think that's a huge piece of advice that everyone listening today should take home with them. You ought to be strategic with your residency application. You cannot wing this. You cannot just freeload it and expect something at the end. There must be a plan in place. And that's something that I hone in on extremely on IMG Roadmap in our online school, the IMG Roadmap course, is teaching IMGs how to create a strategy that works for them. Not a strategy that works for everyone, but you have to look at your individual scenario. What am I coming into the door with? How can I leverage what I already have and make my story convincing? Case in point, for the listeners today, Dr. Pospos sent me an email, and your email, when I read it and with what you're telling me now, it makes perfect sense. Because even in the way that you introduced yourself and wanted to be on the podcast, which is open to IMGs just like you who have a lot of value to add, the way that it was written caught my attention. It also wanted me to want to speak to you. And the reason being, you thought about the audience first. You thought about the other person who's going to read that email first. And therefore, when you presented your case, it was particular to the points that would tug on my heartstrings to want to respond, right? And I think IMGs have lost that art of networking, right? It's like we forget that we're interacting with humans who have desires, wants, and needs, just like we do. And so between all the fluff, between everything going on in everybody's individual life, how you write your emails, how you present yourself, how you network makes a difference between a delete your email versus, I want to learn, I want to meet this person, right? And it looks like you started working on that process way early, and it just segued and tumbled into massive interview invitations. And I want everyone listening to us today to take home that one point. You need a strategy. Well, it's not one point, several points. You need a strategy. You need to be intentional, like Dr. Pospos is sharing, and you need to have a plan around what you want to do. So let's talk about the master's program, because I know we're going to have some people in the comments saying, well, do I need a master's program to match? I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Do IMGs need to pursue a master's degree in order to match?
I personally don't think so. But in my case, like you said, everyone has different stories. So we just have to own it, right? And in my case, the master's may or may not be viewed as non-medicine related. So it may or may not be kind of like a red flag in that sense. It's definitely an added time between your year of graduation and application time. So it's just positioning yourself again in terms of how you quote unquote sell yourself, or how you, whatever you have, whatever your skills and qualifications can specifically help to fill that needs of the program or of your audience in this case.
Absolutely. Because I get that question often as well from, people that want my advice or recommendations. And I usually tell them, you need to consider the big picture. There's no utility in doing things just to check off boxes. Once you start finding yourself in that position where your actions are driven by checking a box, you've lost it. You may as well just stop doing everything, because you are not going to get anywhere doing stuff like that. One, you'll waste time and money on a program that you have no interest in. That makes it more difficult to pursue. It makes the homework assignments hell. It makes the projects that come with it just tedious. And then you're taking away valuable time you could be using on something else. Now, it's different when you have a passion about something. Like in your case, you weren't intentionally doing a master's just to get into residency. You were doing it for other purposes, but then you found a way to own that story and say, hey, if I'm going to create my own medical success story, I can have to use my psychology background and everything I've learned and become a psychiatrist in the United States, right? But I think we forget the power of our own story. And I hope that more IMGs can learn from you today that at the end of the day, we are the underwriters of our stories. Like, we get to tell other people what to think about our application, how you write it out, what you write in your personal statement. That's you selling yourself. And if you don't do a good job at that, nobody can sell you to a program if you don't fulfill or meet what you're selling. Like, it's just not possible. So instead of just checking boxes or, and I give grief to people who hire people just to do things for them, you're not going to win that way because you don't have meat, you don't have stake in it. And so thanks for sharing your opinion on that. So let's segue a little bit into your recommendations for psych residency application. What are some things that you have noticed, especially because you just finished training? So you have a fresh perspective as a senior resident, probably as someone who's interviewed others. But can you tell us a little bit more about your perspective on what you think IMGs need to be bringing to the table today in 2022?
Yeah, definitely. So I think in all specialty, but perhaps specifically for psychiatry, we're looking for someone who's genuinely want to be there, right? And the way you can showcase that is through your whole applications as a whole. So your CV, your experience, your research, just kind of like your activities outside medicine too. Perhaps if it could all be tied into psychiatry, that'd be great. And then the other thing that I believe is also important is how you present it in terms of being objective versus subjective. And what I mean by that is I always try to highlight numbers and concrete facts when highlighting my achievements or things that I do versus just fluff or, like rosy, wordy description of some things. And I think that speaks a lot to what you have accomplished. And you can also, bonus point, do it in a very succinct, concise way before people start losing interest. In terms of logistics, like statistics, scores, but now it doesn't matter as much anymore because of the pass or fail, numbers of publications, numbers of US clinical rotations and whatnot. I don't think it matters per se in terms of that black and white sense. It's just, again, the way you strategically position and ties everything up to be an ideal candidate and how you can sell it consistently.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you're straight on the point. It's not about even just one specialty like psych. It's every specialty. These rules apply, or we don't want to call them rules, but these sort of tenets apply. Going to some specifics, what are some things that you recommend for the applicant that is preparing an application for the next cycle? And they're thinking, well, I'm really interested in psych and I want my personal statement to stand out. What storyline or approach can they use to really show interest? Are personal statements deemed highly in your application process?
Yes, I believe so. Perhaps even more than other specialties, I would think. Just as an example, during my interview trail, I get a lot of comments about my personal statements. And I think that's one of the key things, at least in psychiatry, that we could focus on. So my tips for that would be there's a thin line between owning your personal story, not sounding too generic or too fluffy in that sense, and also having personal statement as a tool, an objective tool to again highlight your achievements instead of just painting rosy pictures, of an essay of what do you think the other person wanted to hear. So just using mine as an example, in my personal statement, I talk about my experience as a former student athlete. I actually talked about how I was first didn't get into the team on my first tryout and how it lights up the desire in me to keep working hard, to keep working on my skills, day in, day out until eventually not only that they let me in, but also I become one of the main players, starting players instead of those just who are in the bench.
Yeah, I think that's really great that, what you mentioned in light of using personal experiences to extrapolate as to character, because you used a story of not getting on the team the first time, but then it takes resiliency, right? It takes people being persistent to try out again. And in many ways that translates to how you function as a human. And so I think a lot of times we miss those opportunities in really in showing people instead of telling them. Like, it's one thing to show somebody how resilient you are by sharing a story, as opposed to telling somebody, oh, I'm resilient, I'm hardworking. It's like, oh, everybody says that, right? So how can I be convinced that you are? And when it comes to, let's talk about letters as far as for psych applicants, do they have to have all their letters from psychiatrists here, or how does that work? Or can they have a variety and US versus non-US letters and such?
I personally think US letters are best. And there are several reasons for that. One, it's from the US, right? So by default, the readers knows about the institutions and, how they're all accredited here, up to par in terms of their standards for psych programs and whatnot. But perhaps a more important part of that is your letter writers, especially if it's coming from an academic settings, universities and whatnot. They might be thought leaders in the field, or at the very least, they know people, right? The academic circles are small, especially in psychiatry. So they might be a personal friend or at least, a colleague of the readers. And therefore, their opinions would be more strongly considered versus, let's say, a random person who the reader doesn't even know about.
Yes, a relationship, whether it's a pre-existing professional relationship, and it doesn't even have to be a personal relationship where they know one another. It's just being able to identify someone's credentials and being able to recognize that they hold a position that you can trust. And I think it's a subconscious influence or an impact to your packet when you have the US letters. Absolutely. I agree 100%. And so do they have to have all from psych, or can they have a variety?
Yes. So for me personally, I use all psych. Looking back, I think all psych would work perfect, but if not, perhaps one of somewhat related field, like, for example, family medicine or internal medicine or neurology might work too, because, almost all patients have psych components, right? A lot of patients presented to primary care with, depression, anxiety, insomnia, and whatnot.
That is true.
And also for psych, at least during your first year, first 6 months is going to be spent in internal medicine and neurology rotation anyway. So that could help in terms of that.
Absolutely. And does it matter if these letters come from MD, DOs, both, neither?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it does. That was just a question someone had sent to me in direct messaging actually today. And I was like, no, like nobody cares. But we don't, as IMGs, we don't know. So, they want to make sure that they're doing the right thing. And then let's talk a little bit about some of your passions. I think, in your description, you told me that you love to also be able to help IMGs. And why? Like, what was your drive? Like, what happened along the way that built up this passion to want to help other people?
Yeah, definitely. So I love to help IMGs, because first and foremost, I was an IMG. So I've been there. I did experience all the feeling of being overwhelmed, not knowing where to start, pulled in every direction, second guessing myself a lot, my decision. Is this the right one? Is this going to pay off? Am I going to get a place, a residency spot eventually, or is this all a waste and whatnot? Right. So I just want to pay it forward and give back, to hopefully be helpful in that struggle. But also the second part of it is my passion is to help high performers in general, just to optimize and balance their lives, by incorporating things like exercise, sleep, stress management, nutrition, and other sustainable lifestyle changes to get into that goal. And I think that could also really be applied to IMGs, especially given all the challenges that might arise. It's very easy to not focus on self-care within this process. And that could make a huge difference in one's life, I think.
You are very right. I think that there is less of a focus on self-care during the IMG journey, right? Like when you're still in that hustle to residency, it's like it's a reckless abandon. You're doing everything you can. You want this so bad, you would do anything anyone asks from you. What are some tips that IMGs can incorporate? And this also applies to international medical students who maybe are still in school, as well as international medical graduates who may have already completed school. So how do we go about creating a self-care plan in this process? Because I'll tell you, I was not thinking about my self-care. I didn't even know what self-care was, to be honest, when I was, in that race to residency. It was just do, eat, sleep. I never exercised. What was exercise? You just, right. You just try to survive. You're in survival mode. And when we're in survival mode, obviously our reptilian brain is awake, and that's all that matters, right? We're just kind of not really considering everything else, right? But just an overdrive, sympathetic responses on high. You're always anxious, always on the edge, like just ready for something bad to happen. So how do we manage? What are some self-care things that as students, as graduates, we can incorporate to cope?
Yeah, definitely. I'm really glad you were bringing it up. So one thing that I think we could incorporate as busy IMG or in our busy lives in general is exercise. So my personal principle is, it's always most effective when you're using things that require brain power to focus on that single task. But when you're doing things that doesn't require as much brain power, you could always multitask or cluster task. An example being some sort of exercise, right? So for example, for me, when I was studying for my steps or when I was just doing work in my computer in general, I tried to simultaneously exercise. And the way I did that is I bought a little desk extension to put kind of like to raise my laptop. And then I bought a little stepper. That way, while I'm doing things in the computer, typing and whatnot, doing key banks and stuff like that, I could do my steps just to get my heart rate up. That way I kill two birds with one stone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very brilliant. Now, somebody else may be watching and saying, well, I don't have the resources to invest, maybe in a stepper or a treadmill or whatever. But I actually saw a stepper on Amazon. It's like that little thing where it's just two pedals, and it wasn't that expensive. It was like in the $20 or so. Like you can get something like that where it's stationary. And so you're just going up and down on it while working on a table, like the table I'm using right now. I got this on Amazon too. I think it was under $100. And it's one of those where you can fold it away and then you can pack it back up. It doesn't quite extend, but I've found some of those extendable ones, like those hospital bed trays, like in hospital, those bedside stools. Who knows? Ask your hospital if they have one they want to donate. But, I think that's a good, easy tip, right? Because we're sitting for 8-9 hours studying. I'm studying for boards right now. And I'm like, oh my God, can't wait to do this podcast episode so I can get a break from studying. But, so I understand that 100%. And any other like nutrition recommendations for IMGs during this period?
Yeah. So for nutrition, it's probably a given, but it's always good to focus on the whole foods, right? The less processed, the better, obviously. I think in terms of nutrition and just lifestyle in general, nutrition, exercise, sleep, and whatnot, some is always better than none. So we don't have to be perfect. Not only in those categories, of course, in life too. We just need to commit to a little bit. It's always better than nothing. So we don't have to, beat ourselves up if we're not eating perfectly, let's say, for this whole week, 7 days a week. Right. Something is always better than nothing.
Right. I agree. And especially if you notice, okay, I'm slipping, I'm not eating right now. Well, is it possible that maybe the next meal you make a better choice? The next day you make a better choice? Like, give yourself grace, I think, in all of this, right? Like, we need to give ourselves more grace. But then how about sleep? What are your recommendations for, because that's another big thing. I think a lot of people have a hard time studying because they're not sleeping well. Like they're not restful, they're not resting well. And so they get tired easy, they get hunger pains and cravings, while they're studying. And even the food groups that they're picking out, right? Like, if you're going to be studying for 8 hours a day, you probably want to eat like protein in the morning, right? Not carbs that are going to make you crash within a couple of hours. That way, if you're having chicken breast or eggs or, whatever protein you like, if you're vegan, but you're able to have energy that's going to sustain you for several hours and prevent these rapid crashes from increased glycemic index. But what are your food recommendations, nutrition recommend? Oh, you already talked about nutrition. I was talking about sleep. Sorry. Your sleep recommendations for rest, for effective studying to keep the brain awake and active during that study period.
Yeah, definitely. So, back then, from my experience, it's kind of hard to log in 8 hours of sleep when you have so much to do, right? You probably want to just stay up late or wake up early to study just to get more reps done in terms of U-World questions and whatnot. But some of my tips to get that quality of sleep is first to just use bed for sleep or sex. So no, watching TV or no reading, studying in bed if you can help it. If you cannot go to sleep, like if you lay down and then just find yourself not sleeping, after 30 minutes, just get out of bed. Because that way you associate bed simply with sleep in your brain, and that would help. And then some things to avoid: caffeine. My recommendations would be to avoid it about 10 to 12 hours before bed. So perhaps if you can take the last coffee intake maybe by noon or so. And then other things to avoid at least 3 hours before bed would include things like drinks, like alcohol, dinner, especially big dinner, exercise. Exercise is always good, but it's better to do it during daytime because it might stimulate your brain and all your body functions if it's done too close to bed. And just kind of like stressful things, if you can help it. Stressful things, meaning things that require brain power, like studying, trying to solve a problem, things like that. And then 1 hour before bed, of course, ideally no screen time, right? Because of the blue light that might impair your sleep hormone and whatnot.
Yeah, I love those. And I think when you were talking, I was like, so no Q banks in bed, right? we can't do the Q banks while we're laying in the bed. Is that what you're saying?
Ideally. Ideally.
I will try not to do my Q bank tonight in my bed. I will sit up and sit on this desk that I got from Amazon. So I think but that's good, because when we go to bed with the computer in our face and we wonder why we can't fall asleep, because there's insomnia from that light effect on our eyes. And then in addition to that, there's the stress of thinking about the exam and maybe other family problems, other health problems. Your body hurts, your back hurts. And so definitely need to cater to ourselves a little bit more. And because obviously you're a psychiatrist, we want to benefit from your knowledge. What are some study techniques that help, especially if you're dealing with what I would call like a seasonal depression because of, not being where you want to be in life, or you may call it, I don't know what category it falls under, an acute stress disorder or the dysphoria, whatever, where we're not clinically depressed, but we're just like, this is hard. It is difficult. It is challenging. Some days you just feel like giving up. You feel like quitting. You feel like walking away, only to realize that you love it so much and you can't really walk away. So What are your recommendations for those for those that are in that position right now?
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. First of all, I'd like everyone to know that despite doing all the things right, despite taking care of ourselves, doing things by the book, these things are very common, right? So burnout, test anxiety, imposter syndrome, just feeling overwhelmed and done with things, especially during this IMG process and journey, they're very common. It happens to a lot of us. However, if it starts to, one, causing you severe distress, or two, interfere with your daily functions, so that could be interfering with your grades, your work, your relationships, things like that, it's a good idea to seek help, additional help in psychiatry. So in terms of tips, first of all, is to recognize it. We all learn about depression, for example, the CE caps, anxiety symptoms, insomnia symptoms, and also recognize that when it does interfere with your daily function, then it's time to seek help. That would be my first step. And then in terms of studying from a psychiatry or kind of like a brain science perspective, what I would recommend, I have a couple of tips. First, like I mentioned, to focus on a single task because it requires brain power. It's so much better than to multitask it. So doing questions while switching back and forth, let's say between video questions. It's better from the brain power perspective to just focus on a single task or a single topic for a while. And then after that, moving on to another to avoid that energy consumption of switching back and forth. The second tip would be the 20/80 principles and what we know as quote unquote high yield. So just realize that, not every task is created equally in terms of their effects. So for example, when we're studying, let's say the 20% or the high yield topics would be, let's say, pathology or physiology. It would be better to focus your energy if time is limited on that versus just blatantly memorizing genetic disorders that might come up only once or twice in the test, right? And then the third tips I have would be to use Pomodoro techniques or something similar. And the timing could be different, but typically it would involve working straight for, let's say, 55 minutes and then take 5 minutes break after and do that in cycles. But of course, like I mentioned, you could always change the minutes to, for example, 50-10, 45-15, whatever works best for you.
I love these tips. I think they're so great because I was listening and I'm like, I need to incorporate some of them, especially the Pomodoro technique, because I have a lot of studying to do for the next few weeks. My board exam is scheduled in 3 weeks. And I'm like, oh my God, freaking out. But I think definitely block scheduling is a good thing where you just focus on one thing. And I didn't realize that there was a lot of consumption of mental energy, like you mentioned, when you switch from one task to the other. And now that you said it, I can see how that is. Because I oftentimes, you wonder why you feel exhausted, right? Because you've been doing all these different things in one sitting. And last night, my husband was making fun of me because my internet browser tab had like 17 tabs open.
Oh my goodness.
including my QBank. And he's like, wow, you're getting so much done with 17 tabs open. And I thought, yeah, he's right. Like, I'm not getting any, I'm not able to do as much as I would want to because I have 17 tabs open. And so, those are just really very key ways that IMGs can implement. And I'm going to implement this as well for the next 3 weeks as I crunch down. So how can IMGs connect with you and, learn from you and, be in contact with you?
Yes, absolutely. So my website is lifestyletelepsychiatry.com. If you want more free resources like the ones we talk about, for example, today, you could always hit subscribe. So lifestyletelepsychiatry.com/subscribe, or I can be contacted on Instagram as well with the same handle, Lifestyle Telepsychiatry.
Yeah, we'll have all your information in the show notes for anyone interested. But before we let you go, can you give us some 3 mantras for success or sort of a closing blessing for the listener today who is an international medical student that's sitting at home just like, man, I want to get in psych residency so bad. And they feel like it is so far away. What are your top 3 words of wisdom for them?
Yes, definitely. So I'm going to answer that in two parts, if I may. My mantra is actually take it one task at a time. So it's not even one day at a time, but one task at a time. And a funny story behind that is I actually came across this when I was working at UCLA doing research on depression. One of the participants, she was older, but she shared during her younger days, she was simultaneously working at a law firm, getting or attending grad school. And at that time, she also had a bout of depression. So obviously, it's very hard to get anything done at that time, right? So she told me she did it one task at a time, meaning she just need to get into the shower. And then after it's done, she just need to get into her car. She just needs to get to drive to work, and then she just needs to find a parking space and so forth. So that resonates really, strongly with me, and I'm forever grateful for that advice because I'm still using it to this day, time and time again.
Love it.
And then the second part would be my parting words to those aspiring psychiatry applicants and aspiring psychiatry residents out there. Let's just take a second here and imagine. What if you can no longer feel lost, overwhelmed, and not knowing where to start, right? And instead you could have a clear goal on what you want, not what everyone else wants, but what you want. What if there's no more fear, no more doubt, no more second guessing yourself at every steps and every decision, and instead you could have a clear steps on what to do, how to get there, and what to do every day to get there. Imagine feeling empowered, even when you have to handle multiple tasks at once, because you can clearly see your progress day in and day out. Where on your journey, it's not just some random, light at the end of the road that may or may not ever come. For example, you're 60% done out of the 100%. So, you're a doctor. Just as a reminder, only 7% of everyone got accepted into med school on average. Some of you even move here from another country, and you don't only have to deal with residency application stuff, but literally starting everything from scratch. That's a big task. So if I can do it, you can do it. If others can do it, you can do it. Just remember, you got this.
Thank you so much for sharing that. What if, guys, what if it all worked out at the end of the day? What if we all got to where we wanted to be because we, like you said, define what was important for us, not what everybody else thinks is important for us. Just what if? Thank you for coming on the show, Dr. Pospos. We're so happy to have you. We'll have all your links in the show notes, guys. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you right now to go to the show notes, read through, connect with her. But more importantly, my webinar is still up for a limited time only. And that's drninaloom.com/webinar, where you learn how you can create a competitive application for yourself. Thank you so much for coming on. I wish you the very best.
Thank you so much, Dr. Loom. And may I also add, I'm such a big fan of you. As a fellow IMG, a very successful female doc and entrepreneur. You're killing it with everything, with your business, your books, just everything. It's also inspiring. And I wanted to thank you so much for all that you do too.
Thank you for saying that. Oh my gosh, guys, I did not ask her to say that. So thanks so much for sharing that.